Hello everyone, hope you're doing well and staying safe. Today's video is not whatsoever related to my normal book content, but a few months ago I did a video all about my job, industrial organizational psychology, and grad school if you're interested in that field. And in it, I sort of offhand mentioned that I used to be horrified of public speaking, and now that is the main focus of my job. And I got a lot of comments and questions from people who wanted to hear public speaking tips from someone who used to be just petrified by the idea of it. For a little bit of context, I'm going to admit a couple very embarrassing facts, but I dealt with a lot of social anxiety growing up. But one of the key factors I would look at when I was choosing my classes for undergrad was which ones did not involve public speaking. And when I did have to public speak, there were a couple times where I took a couple shots in advance hoping that that would help. It did not. And now, like I said, I probably am presenting on average about 4 to 5 hours a week, either formal presentations or live facilitations to a bunch of businesses. And by no stretch of the imagination am I an amazing public speaker. I still have a lot to learn. But personally, if I was similar to one of you watching this video right now, I would much rather hear tips from someone who used to be in the same situation than someone who has just been naturally confident up on the stage. So I'm going to go through my top 10 tips. Keep in mind, not all of these apply for every public speaking situation. Because of course, if I'm walking through these, think about whether or not they apply for your certain situation. So let's go ahead through my top 10 in no particular order. Number 1 is to work on your mindset. And what I mean by that is a lot of us who deal with maybe social anxiety or imposter syndrome at school or at work, one thing that really tends to upset us, and definitely used to upset me, was when I would look at other classmates, coworkers, team members who seemingly were able to get up and present, and I could tell, or at least I thought, that they hadn't practiced and still did an amazing job. And so the more and more time I put into practicing, preparing for my presentations, I was riddled with more and more anxiety because I thought I just must suck at this because I'm having to prepare so much in comparison to these other people. And at least now I view that as a very juvenile mindset. But I would think about the fact, and you can go Google this, there are great videos about it, most TED Talks, those presentations, are prepared and memorized 1 month in advance. I'm not saying you need to do that for work or for school. I definitely don't do that, but I think it's just good for shifting your mindset to understand that most of the amazing speeches that you've seen have had hours upon hours of effort put into them. Even if you're someone who's naturally a great public speaker and is very confident on the stage, which is a very tiny percent of the population, I would argue that in any situation, the more preparation, the better. Not necessarily that you have to memorize the whole thing, but in my opinion, 99% of presentations are better at least with a little bit of preparation, so don't get down on yourself for needing to prepare so much. Next is a tip for if, for example, you do have to memorize your presentation. And for those of us who do have a lot of anxiety around presenting, you might stumble over your words, get so nervous that you go blank and forget your next sentence. So it is often really helpful to really be at the point where, again, I don't recommend drinking on stage, it makes it worse, but just as an analogy, I recommend having it down so well if you are someone who's really nervous that you could be blackout drunk and still recall most of the presentation. For doing that is to type out the bullet points, the key content you're trying to cover, sit there and talk through it to yourself, and then get your phone and record yourself saying the presentation. Then for the next few days, week, whatever, as you're going about your life, doing chores, running groceries, you can be listening back to that over and over again. And I'm not saying that that should be in place of just standing up in your room alone and practicing, but that can be so helpful in knocking out a lot of the memorization piece without a lot of effort. Now, to be blunt, I don't do this pretty much anymore at all, but I would say that I did this more so in grad school because for a few of our classes we did have to memorize our presentations, and for me that was such a helpful low effort way of memorizing. My tip 3 is more so about tone of voice. I should have researched this a little bit more so I could say the actual biological terms, but it's so helpful to just put your hand here and try and speak lower and slower than you normally would. This is obvious, so I won't harp on it, but a lot of us have a tendency to talk very fast when we're nervous when we're presenting. So it's very helpful to talk lower and slower than even feels natural, and to also really include a lot of pauses. Pauses weirdly can be very powerful. You don't want to string one sentence straight through to the next because people's brains listening are trying to digest and taking in what you're saying. And if you're speaking so fast, sort of like how I am right now, But granted, I put a lot less effort into these videos than I do my presentations at work, if I'm honest. But the faster you're speaking, it comes across as almost your words don't have value because you're going through and just spitting them out so fast. Number 4, this sounds very cheesy and simple, but this is the main piece of feedback that I got when I was going through some presentation training for work. I had to get this sort of facilitation presentation certification. So we would present and then we would get feedback from like expert presenters. So a lot of what I'm passing on are things that they told me. But as simple as this sounds, one of the most important things they told me was to smile. Now granted, given the topic of your presentation, if it's very somber, maybe that doesn't make sense to do, but I think in like 85% of situations, it's very helpful to smile. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that if you're someone who deals with social anxiety and presenting, you probably have a tendency to become maybe a little bit stilted, rigid, overly formal when you're presenting, because we're almost just trying to hide away inside of our bodies. And one of the main tips I got when I would present to this expert was he came back and he said, flat out told me, and this is my first couple times presenting to him, he said there were a couple times where he started to lose interest and then I would smile and he was pulled right back in. So for me, a lot of my presentations right now are over Zoom. So I will put literally in my notes, instead of actually having notes, I will just put smile in caps so that when I go to the next slide, I have that as a reminder in case I've been forgetting. Of course, take all these tips with a grain of salt and think through them. I'm not saying to smile like a maniac the whole way through, but at least occasionally throw in that smile because it just makes you seem so much more warm and personal and inviting. Tip number 5 is about what I just mentioned, Zoom, because I'm guessing whether you're in work or you're in school, a lot of you are probably having to give your presentations now over Zoom. And a great tip, especially for those of you who don't have 2 separate screens, because normally if you have 2 screens, you could have the slides on one screen and then maybe some notes on the other. If you're someone who doesn't have 2 screens, you can go to advanced and then share portion of screen, and then you would go to presenting the slides and then go to show presenter view. This is hard to describe. I'm not going to go in detail in this video. You can Google it, but this can be very helpful so that if you are really nervous, you can have a few notes to the side up on your screen and not, for example, written out down in your lap so you're staring down at yourself. To the audience, it will really look like you're not looking at notes. Now the caveat with that is to not write out full sentences. Nothing is more boring than listening to someone read. You don't want to come across as too stilted. So what can be helpful is, for example, just having maybe the first few words you're going to say in the presentation in case you get really nervous. You have that at least to get you going. But if you are nervous, having a few keywords or phrases or things that you think you might forget are still helpful to have in that note section, and people will not be able to notice so long as you're not reading. Number 6 is also a little bit about your mindset, but more focused around your energy. View it as a positive that you're nervous because your body is filled with a lot of energy, which is a good thing. What a lot of us will tend to do, and I mentioned this before, is when we're very nervous, we'll try and just push down our energy and lower our heart rate and try and be less nervous. But what that can do is it can backfire because, one, it's really hard to just make yourself calm down when you're nervous in a presentation starting in 30 seconds. And also what it can do is it can make us come across as really boring when we present because we're just so focused on tampering our emotions down. A great phrase I heard once, and I can't remember where I heard it from, was instead of trying to kill the butterflies, to try and orient them in the same direction. Take your butterflies, your nerves, instead of smashing them, just orient them towards excitement. There's some psychology behind this because it's a lot easier for our brains when we're nervous to channel it to convince ourselves that we're excited and not nervous. And I have to say, some of my best presentations have been when I'm still a little bit nervous. And some of my worst ones have been when I had just presented really well and I had another one coming up and I was like, whatever, I'm not nervous at all, this will be fine. And I didn't have a ton of energy during the presentation, so a little bit of nerves are actually a really great thing sometimes. Number 7, and of course this is going to be dependent on the specific type of situation and whether or not this makes sense, but I highly recommend engaging your audience within the first 2 minutes. As nervous as you might be, most of the time people are often getting really bored, especially during these Zoom presentations. I forget the exact amount of time, but the brain loses interest in these presentations so quickly. So I recommend, even if it's just asking a question in chat, asking a question out loud and seeing if people raise their hand, ask something within the first 2 minutes. And also, if possible, granted, again, it depends on the topic, try and engage the audience in some way like that at least every 10 minutes throughout. And if you can get some discussion going, it also gives you a chance to breathe as well. Number 8 is especially helpful if you're worried about either coming across as a little bit boring or if you're worried about completely forgetting your notes. And that's to either start out with some sort of story or include different stories throughout. If we are nervous, blacking out in fear, it's really hard for our brain to remember, bullet points, to remember a list of ideas. It's so much easier for us to remember stories. And for an audience, it's also much more memorable and interesting for them to hear stories. If it's something related to the workplace, Harvard Business Review is a really good place to read some articles and find, some interesting research or an interesting story. And again, it's easier for your brain to remember, especially if you get so nervous you forget exactly what you planned on saying. And it's a lot more interesting and memorable for the audience. And with that, I would think, even though this isn't necessarily a story, think about what your one key idea is you want the audience to go away with. One mistake a lot of us make is trying to cram too much information. I think there's some sad stat that after you do some type of training or live session, everyone will forget 60 to 70% of it the next day. So just keep that in mind. And what's the one central idea, the one key point that you want people to go away with, and just keep driving that home throughout. Then number 9 is nailing your opening. If you're someone who has a lot of anxiety around public speaking, those first 30 seconds to 3 minutes are probably the most nerve-wracking. And what I found is if I really have that opening down, and say for example, I haven't had a ton of time to prepare for the rest of the presentation, if I nail that opening, it calms me down at least a little bit, increases my confidence, and I can present much better throughout the entire session. So for example, if you are just very against memorizing presentations because you think it will come across as too stilted, I still would recommend at least memorizing what you're going to say for the first 30 seconds or so. And number 10, and the most important and probably the most obvious that you all can guess I was going to say, is to practice at least 2 times live with people prior to the presentation. And I want to emphasize the 2 times because I think the first time can be when maybe you don't have it down perfect, you just want to practice, get reactions, see how it goes. Then you can maybe wait a day or 2, take into account some edits you realize that just didn't work when you were doing it live. Practice again once you feel a lot more confident and comfortable. You can practice with your parents, your grandparents, your friends. If you don't have family or friends, you can go on, I don't know, Omegle, I don't know. But I do think practicing with an audience is so helpful, and it might not be for what you think. Granted, I'm not practicing with people for every presentation for work these days, but in the past I did this and it was really helpful. I think it's helpful not necessarily even to get their feedback because you're probably practicing to a group that isn't the audience you're going to be presenting to, so they might not have contact, so maybe their feedback won't be that valuable, but it's just so helpful for your mindset because you will, even if it's just one person you're comfortable with, you will get some of those nerves and you can see how things will play out that might have been different than when you're just recording yourself or practicing alone. So those are my 10 tips, and again, I think public speaking is the number 2 fear above dying, although I've heard that anywhere, who knows if that's actually true. So just keep in mind, a lot of people deal with this fear as well, and if I can get better at it, trust me, you can. And if you have any tips that I haven't mentioned in this video, please put them below, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.